Project Pigeon trained kamikaze birds to guide missiles. Yes, the United States military actually tried to build a missile guided by live pigeons, and it almost worked. The man behind it was not a mad scientist in a basement. He was one of the most respected psychologists of the 20th century, and the weapon he designed was genuinely, terrifyingly close to being approved for combat. This is the full story of Project Pigeon. To understand why this happened, you need to understand the problem that consumed American military planners throughout World War II. Precision mattered. Or more accurately, the complete lack of it was costing lives and losing battles. In the early 1940s, aerial bombing was shockingly inaccurate. A crew could drop hundreds of bombs on a target and miss the majority of them. Studies conducted during the war revealed that from high altitude, only a fraction of bombs fell within a useful radius of the intended target. This was not a matter of courage or effort. It was a physics problem. Wind, speed, altitude, visibility. Every variable stacked against the bombardier. And in 1943, the United States did not yet have reliable electronic guidance systems mature enough for widespread deployment. So when a behavioral psychologist from the University of Minnesota came to the National Defense Research Committee with a plan to solve the guidance problem using trained birds, the committee did not immediately laugh him out of the room. They gave him $25,000 and told him to prove it could work. The man's name was Burris Frederick Skinner. The world knew him as B.F. Skinner. Skinner was born in 1904 in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. He started his academic career wanting to be a novelist. After receiving encouragement from the poet Robert Frost but concluding that he lacked the worldly depth to write meaningful fiction, he pivoted to science. By the time the war began, Skinner was already famous in the scientific world. He had developed what became known as the Skinner box, an apparatus used to study how animals responded to rewards and punishments. He had trained rats to pull levers for food pellets. He had demonstrated, with remarkable consistency, that behavior could be shaped, reinforced, and reliably predicted through a system of rewards. He called this operant conditioning. What the military community did not yet know, and what Skinner himself was beginning to realize, was that his ideas about behavioral shaping could be applied far beyond the psychology laboratory. The seed of Project Pigeon was planted on a cold April day in 1940. Skinner was traveling by train from Minneapolis to Chicago for the annual meeting of the Midwestern Psychological Association. As the train moved through the landscape, he was thinking about the recent Nazi bombing of Warsaw, the destruction, the civilian casualties, the seemingly unstoppable precision of German air power against defenseless cities. He was turning over in his mind the problem of smart weapons. How could a small nation defend itself against a technologically superior air force? You would need a missile that always found its mark. Then he looked out the window and saw a flock of pigeons. They were wheeling in tight formation in the sky, banking and diving together with a fluid coordination that no mechanical system of the era could match. And Skinner later recalled the exact moment the idea struck him. In his own words, "Suddenly I saw them as devices with excellent vision and extraordinary maneuverability. Could they not guide a missile?" To appreciate why Skinner thought pigeons specifically were the right animal for this role, you need to understand what a pigeon actually is from a biological standpoint. Because the military officials who later dismissed the project as absurd were underestimating the animal. Pigeons have 5 types of retinal pigmentation, compared to 3 in humans. They have 2 focal regions in their eyes, which means they can focus on 2 different distances simultaneously. They can detect the position of the sun even on overcast days and use that to navigate. Pigeons were used as military messengers throughout both world wars with exceptional reliability. During World War I, a pigeon named Cher Ami carried a critical message through heavy German fire to save the lost battalion of the 77th Division, a documented historical event that earned the bird a military medal. Skinner knew all of this. He was not choosing pigeons arbitrarily. He chose them because they were the best available biological system for sustained visual tracking under chaotic conditions. In his research, a single trained pigeon pecked at a target more than 10,000 times in 45 minutes under test conditions. That is not a curiosity. That is a guidance mechanism operating at a rate of roughly 222 corrections per minute. Before settling on pigeons, Skinner also tested crows. He admired their intelligence and thought their more aggressive temperament might suit a weapons application. The crows were promising test subjects until they were not. He removed them from the project after they pecked out the eyes of one of his pigeons. After that, the crows were gone. The pair of birds Skinner initially brought home from the poultry shop eventually formed the nucleus of a team of more than 30 trained pigeon bombardiers. Now here is how the actual guidance system was designed, and it is remarkable in its mechanical elegance. The testbed airframe was an unpowered glide bomb, essentially a small winged missile with a warhead section and a nose cone. 3 lenses were mounted in the nose of the device. These lenses projected a live image of the terrain ahead onto a small screen mounted inside the nose cone on pivots. The screen was fitted with sensors that could detect any angular movement. Trained pigeons, between 1 and 3 birds depending on the configuration, were housed in small compartments inside the nose cone. Each pigeon faced the screen. They had been conditioned through weeks of training to recognize the specific visual pattern of the intended target. A naval vessel, a factory complex, a harbor installation. When they saw the target appear in the center of the screen, they pecked at it. As long as they kept pecking the center, the screen stayed centered, and the bomb stayed on course. But here is the genius of the system. If the bomb began drifting off target, due to wind, aerodynamic instability, or any other variable, the image of the target would shift toward the edge of the screen. The pigeon, trained to follow the image, would naturally move its head and peck toward the edge. This movement was detected by the screen's sensors, which translated it into signals sent to the control surfaces on the bomb's fins. The fins adjusted, the bomb corrected. The target came back to center. The system was, in effect, a closed-loop guidance mechanism using biological hardware. The same basic principle that would later be implemented in early electronic guidance systems, detect deviation, generate correction signal, adjust course, was already working in Skinner's nose cone, just with feathers instead of transistors. Skinner also addressed a significant tactical problem. What happens when 2 targets appear on the screen simultaneously? He proposed housing 3 pigeons in the nose cone and using a majority rules logic. According to Skinner's own documented notes on the project, if 2 of the 3 birds were pecking toward one target, the third bird was, as Skinner put it, punished for his minority opinion. The majority steered the bomb. Now here is where the story takes its sharpest turn, and it is the part that reveals more about institutional psychology than about animal psychology. By 1943, Skinner had made real progress. His pigeons were trained. The apparatus functioned. He had assembled a team that included graduate students and researchers at the University of Minnesota. His assistant, Norman Gutman, described the frantic atmosphere of the laboratory in his memoirs. Punchboards, photoelectric cells, light beams, improvised components cobbled together under wartime supply constraints. The work was messy, underfunded, and often chaotic, but it was producing results. Skinner took his demonstration to the National Defense Research Committee. The pigeons performed. They tracked targets. They corrected course deviations. They pecked with the single-minded consistency that months of operant conditioning had built into their nervous systems. The committee watched, and then they killed the program. Not because the technology failed. The technology worked. They killed it because they could not get past what they were looking at. Military officials, men who had spent their careers in a world of steel and machinery and engineering, simply could not bring themselves to believe that a bird was a serious weapon. As Skinner himself later wrote about the experience, our problem was no one would take us seriously. The program was officially canceled on October 8, 1944. The stated reason was that further work on Project Pigeon would seriously delay others, which in the minds of the division have more immediate promise of combat application. Translated from bureaucratic language, electronics are coming, and we are not going to explain to Congress that we funded a pigeon bomb. The $25,000 grant produced a functioning prototype, a trained team of biological guidance systems, and a set of engineering principles that would later be independently rediscovered and implemented electronically. None of it ever flew in combat. But the story does not end there. In 1948, the United States Navy quietly revived the project under a new name, Project Orcon. The name stood for Organic Control. Apparently someone in the Navy, 3 years after the war had ended, looked at the problem of missile guidance afresh and arrived at the same conclusion Skinner had reached in 1940. The biological guidance principle was sound. The birds could still do the job. Project Orcon ran from 1948 to 1953. It was canceled a second time, not because it failed, but because by 1953, electronic guidance systems had finally matured to the point where they were reliable enough to replace the organic alternative. The same year Project Orcon was shut down, the Navy deployed the radar-guided Bat Glide bomb, which used the same basic airframe that Skinner had originally worked with. The difference was that the Bat used radar signals to detect and track its target, the electronic equivalent of what the Pigeon's eye had been doing in the nose cone. The irony is layered, and Skinner had essentially built a prototype of a concept, closed-loop target tracking guidance, that the entire missile industry would spend the next decade trying to replicate electronically. He had the right idea at the wrong moment in the development of supporting technology. And Skinner did one more thing after the project ended that speaks to something almost touching about his relationship with his trained birds. He kept them. Long after the war, he would periodically test his original Pigeon bombardiers to see if their training had held. 1 year after the project ended. 2 years. 4 years. 6 years. According to the Smithsonian Institution, which today holds the nose cone prototype in its American History Museum, the Pigeons were still reliably performing their tracking behavior years later. The conditioning held. The birds remembered. The behavioral principles Skinner used, detecting deviation, generating a corrective response, maintaining a target lock, became the intellectual foundation for autopilot and guidance system design throughout the Cold War era. Engineers at organizations including NASA borrowed heavily from control theory concepts that Skinner had demonstrated with pigeons and corn. Skinner himself went on to hold the Edgar Pierce Professorship in Psychology at Harvard University from 1948 until his retirement in 1974. He received the National Medal of Science in 1968. A June 2002 survey of the American Psychological Association listed him as the single most influential psychologist of the 20th century. In 2024, 34 years after his death, Skinner was awarded the Ig Nobel Peace Prize specifically for Project Pigeon. His daughter Julie Vargas accepted the award on his behalf and noted that her father was finally being recognized for this largely forgotten chapter of his career. The original nose cone from Skinner's pigeon-guided missile is currently on display at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. It sits in the Science in American Life exhibition, a piece of hardware that is simultaneously one of the most bizarre and one of the most conceptually sophisticated weapons ever designed. Project Pigeon was not a joke. That is the most important thing to take away from this story. The military officials who dismissed it were not laughing at a crank. They were dismissing a functioning prototype of guidance technology that the defense industry would spend the next decade trying to build with electronics. The problem was never the principle. The problem was perception. There is a deeper lesson here about how institutions evaluate unconventional ideas during crises. The Second World War produced no shortage of strange weapons programs, bat bombs, floating ice aircraft carriers, gliders packed with explosives. Some of them were truly impractical. But Skinner's pigeons were not. They worked under controlled conditions. They were cheap. They were reliable. They required no electronics that could be jammed or fail. And they were dismissed because men in suits could not look past the feathers. The electronic guidance systems that replaced them were better, faster, and scalable in ways biological systems never could be. That is a fair outcome. But the 40 years between Skinner watching pigeons from a train window in 1940 and modern precision-guided munitions passed through a nose cone that held 3 birds pecking at a screen inside a glide bomb. History's most unconventional weapon never fired in anger, but it was right about almost everything.